another awesome set of biblical texts calling us to discern what the Spirit is saying to the church. As mentioned in the bulletin, for me, this is that time of year when I mark the anniversaries of my ordinations. First as a deacon on the 5th of February 1978, and then as a priest on the 11th of February 1979. So let me save you the trouble of doing the maths. That's 47 and 46 years ago, respectively. Not sure how that happened to somebody so young. As always, the Spirit speaks to us, or maybe whispers to us, when we bring our own lived experience into conversations with the great story of faith found in the Bible. We hear the Scriptures through the lens of our own experience, and the Scriptures throw fresh light on that lived experience. So I hear these readings today as somebody who's lived almost 50 years into intentional ordained ministry. And I guess it started even earlier. This might be relevant to Keith, who was at a vocational discernment day yesterday. Where's Keith hiding so I can see him squirming? He was here just before. Lost him. There you go. I think I was 15 when somebody in the congregation at Camp Church of Christ said, "When are you going to go to Bible college and train to become a minister?" So the calling goes back and was affirmed by my church community even as a teenager. I also hear the stories of Jeremiah in Jerusalem and Jesus in Nazareth through the lens of somebody who's very familiar with the streets of both those ancient towns. So Scripture and life and knowledge and experience all swirl around as I reflect on what the Spirit might be saying to me and to us this morning. First reading is the call of Jeremiah, and it's a powerful scene, and whoever put together the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, one of the four great prophetic scrolls of the Old Testament, chose to begin with this pretty awesome scene that we heard read to us just before. So let me try to paraphrase it in slightly more contemporary language. "Since before you were here, I had a plan for you. Don't try and wriggle out of it. Don't claim a lack of experience. Do not be afraid of those to whom I send you to speak. You will sometimes pluck up and destroy. Other times you will build and plant. But at all times you will speak my words." Lucky Jeremiah. It's actually a pretty scary moment for Jeremiah to have had. And a little bit later in the scroll, around about chapter 20 as I recall, I did look it up last night just to remind myself, Jeremiah is complaining, "God, you seduced me. This is not what I wanted." It was a tough gig, and at times Jeremiah wanted out. His response to God's call on his life took him on a long journey of controversy, imprisonment, public punishment, hardship, and eventually enforced exile away from his beloved Jerusalem. That's way too complex a story for one sermon. Perhaps we can tease it out over several weeks in the Tuesday Bible study group. Meanwhile, in Nazareth, in the Gospel story, we have the second part of the story which began last week, which is Luke's story about Jesus visiting the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth. What had started so well quickly turned nasty. By this week's episode, The locals are ready to throw him off the cliff on which their village was built. It's a tense scene as Jesus stares down his critics and almost dares them to try. Interesting, it's kind of the mirror opposite of the temptation narrative. Jump off the cliff, Jesus, God will look after you. Let us throw you off the cliff, Jesus. Just try. Interesting dynamic. It seems they linked. No one laid a hand on Jesus. He passed through their midst and went on his way. And as far as we know, Jesus never went back to Nazareth ever again. They had their choice. They had their moment. They chose not to listen. And indeed, in this episode, Jesus gives one of the very rare sayings which is found in all four Gospels. That it's not common for an event or a saying to occur in all four Gospels, but this is one that does. And in Luke's version, it goes like this: truly, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. And we can find that similar, say, in Mark and Matthew and John, and even in the Gospel of Thomas. The people who know us best are the toughest audience for our ministry. And that's an interesting reflection for me, 47 years into ordained ministry. But of course it applies to us all, not just to clergy, or prophets, or messiahs. Our faithfulness to God's call on us may be patchy, but the crowd will never be happy. You may recall we had another echo of that tough truth last Sunday when I quoted Luke's version of the Beatitudes, and I'll just quote the relevant Beatitude from Luke. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day, for surely your reward is great, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. Jeremiah will go here. And Jesus goes on in Luke's version, woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets. So the passage from Jeremiah and the passage from Luke remind us that it is an awesome thing to be called into the work of being servants of the living God. And all of us have been called into that work when we were baptized. And for all of us, the toughest audience will be the people that know us best. I'm relieved then that in between these two fairly grim passages, the call of Jeremiah and the rejection of Jesus by his hometown in Nazareth, we have the beautiful passage from 1 Corinthians. It reminds us, and again, perhaps just a little aside, when Paul wrote those words in 1 Corinthians 13, he was in the middle of a serious argument with the people at Corinth. And it's like he breaks off in mid-train of thought and actually says, now let me tell you about the best way of all. And he goes on to write a poem to love. Because no matter how grim and challenging at times it can be to be faithful to God's call upon our lives, whether as a priest, whether as a prophet, whether as a teacher or in any other vocation to which God calls us, it remains true that there is no better way to spend a life than spending it in the vocation that God has called us to. And my experience as a person in ministry is that it is a life of blessing and privilege with a few interesting moments scattered here and there along their way. To share your faith journey and to be invited into your lives, even as a temporary priest, a locum, is a huge privilege. We dream dreams together. We shed tears together. We celebrate holy moments, new life, and fresh insights into God's wisdom. And all of us are getting ready to welcome Empole into the life of this faith community. The tough moments are transformed by our shared participation in the grace of God. And that's why I think the passage from Corinthians is so timely. In between the tough call of Jeremiah and the tough gig that Jesus had in his hometown synagogue, there's the beautiful reminder that the one thing that matters is love. And that's a message for me as much as for anyone else. And maybe that's our homework this week, to read and to reflect on this call to the one thing that matters, love. Paul knew a thing or two about tough times in ministry, and as I said, he was in the middle of one of those times when he's writing these chapters from 1 Corinthians. But at the end of chapter 13, he writes these words, "And now, faith, hope, and love abide. These three, and the greatest of these is love."